Been a tough morning. How many of you have lost your fathers? You remember that first Father Day? Well, that's where I'm at right now. So y'all pray for me. If you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter number 21. How many of you have ever heard of a man named Father Abraham? You heard that name before? Father Abraham. You know, something that's interesting in this world in which we live today, and I've done a little bit of what would you call that? Googling? Is that what you call it? Googling? And here's what I was amazed of. You can Google how to be a father, and there's 35,000 different websites that will tell you what kind of parenting skill you should have or how you should view issues and discipline and raising and self-esteem and all that stuff. It blows my mind at how many ideas there are as to what it takes to be a good father. Now, here's what's even more interesting. With all those ideas out there, we're failing. We're failing. So, well, Brother Jeremy, that's not a fair statement. Well, let's just step back and take a bigger picture of it, okay? Is our nation closer to God now than they were 50 years ago? So we're failing, right? Okay, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page because, you know, we need to all be thinking sort of the same direction as we go from here. So it stands to reason some of that falls on the dad, some of that falls on the husband, some of that falls on the men of the house, that we're failing in knowing how to be, what does it take to be a good father. Well, I thought about this long and hard, gave me a headache. But after some thought, I come to this conclusion. Where should we look for a person to give us the example of what a good father is? And I personally could not come up with a better answer than to highlight or show a light upon a guy that God looked upon and deemed him worthy to be referred to as Father Abraham. This was a man that God looked at and said, you know what, I'm going to entrust in him to be the father of many nations. So if that guy found that worthiness from God, then it stands to reason, now this is just my common sense, dumb country way of thinking, that it stands to reason we probably ought to figure a little bit out about this guy. Right? As dads especially, as fathers, we ought to understand what was the qualities about Abraham that God was so willing to entrust in him to be the example of the good father. Well, in Genesis chapter 21, we find a few verses here that I think, if you look at them, they're very enlightening. They enlighten us as to some qualities about Abraham, some facts about Abraham that we should instill upon ourselves so that we can instill them upon our children that they might have a better hope of a future. Okay? So here's what we find out about Abraham. The first thing we find out is that he was a man of unwavering faith. Look in Genesis chapter 21 and verse number 1. It says, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Now here's what we know. God had visited Abraham back, you can look back several chapters back, chapter 14, and he said, Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. Well, now, in order for him to be a father, he was going to have to first have a son. He's going to have a child, right? So Abraham believed by faith what God had told him. Now get this, it was 25 years before God fulfilled that promise of a child. And yet Abraham stuck to it. He had faith in God. He had faith that God would do what he said he would do. And let me tell you, Abraham didn't just have that faith of, I believe there's a God up there somewhere. Abraham had the kind of faith that he walked it, he believed it. He had the kind of faith that he trusted everything with God. You see, you look back over Abraham's life and it's apparent of how much faith he had in God. As a young man, God told him, Abraham, I want you to quit your job. I want you to leave your home. I want you to abandon your friends. I want you to say goodbye to your family, and I want you to start walking this direction, and I'll tell you when you're there. Now, who in their right mind would do that? Who in their right mind would do that? I'll tell you who would do it. A man that has absolutely complete, unwavering faith in God. He walked off. He went exactly as God told him to do. We see this unwavering faith in Abraham throughout his life. Shortly after the scriptures we're reading, God came to Abraham and he said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get up and get your son Isaac, and I want you to go to a mountain that I'm going to tell you, and there I want you to sacrifice your son. Now listen, this is not biblical authority for you to kill your child, okay? I know sometimes, especially when they get teenagers, the thought crosses your mind, but that's not what this story was about. You say, well, preacher, you're talking about this was a good dad, a good father, and he was going to take his son and sacrifice him? No, I said he was unwavering in faith, and he was going to do what God told him to do. And when they reached the place of the mountain, they started up the mountain, they had the fire and the wood, and his son looks up and says, Dad, what about the sacrifice? And Abraham said, son, don't you worry, God will provide himself a sacrifice. You see, Abraham had complete faith that God wasn't going to make him do that. Complete faith. I'm talking about that live-so faith, not the say-so faith. We see throughout his life how he by faith steered around the temptations and the trappings of the world that drew Lot in and drew others in, and yet he maintained his faith in God, that God was the only true and right way. Let me tell you what we need in our nation today. We need some daddies. We need some fathers that'll just stand up and once and for all declare, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. As for me and my house, I'm going to trust God at His word. I'm going to tell you, you cannot get Father of the Year award. You cannot be the dad that you hope to be. You cannot be the father your children deserve apart from having unwavering faith in God. So what was it God saw in Abraham? He saw his unwavering faith. But that wasn't all. It took more than that to get the title of father. He had unwavering faith, but he also had righteous fear. Righteous fear. Look with me in verse 3. It says, and Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac, which means laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Let me tell you what God saw in Abraham. He saw a man that was instilled with righteous fear. Now that righteous fear, let me explain to you what that means. That means that he had the ultimate respect for God. When God said something, he took it as though it came from God. You see, there's a whole lot of you. I stand up here and I'll read to you right out of the Word what God said. Don't shake you a bit. I can read to you every week where it says, and the wages of sin is, don't shake you a bit. You don't have that righteous fear. You see, Abraham understood what was hanging in the balance. He understood that whether I'm obedient to God in righteous fear or not is the difference in life and death. And not only for me, but for my family and my grandkids and generations to come. When did we stop having righteous fear of God? We wonder why we're failing. We wonder why our country is further away from God now than it was 50 years ago. Maybe, just maybe, it's got something to do that we don't have righteous fear for what God says anymore. You see, Abraham was determined. He was absolutely determined to live his life according to what God said. You know what I like about that verse? It says, and Abraham named him Isaac. Well, number one, he named him Isaac because God told him to. Righteous fear. But you see, there was a lot more hanging in the balance here than just having a call sign that the kid would know who he was talking to when he said Isaac. You see, he gave him a name. I'm going to turn back a couple of chapters. I want to read you a verse. I want you to listen to what chapter 17 and verse 19 says. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. You see, he wasn't just naming him Isaac because that was a good name. He was naming him Isaac because he was being in fear of what God had said, because what he knew was hanging in the balance was whether or not Isaac would have that covenant and the seed after him forever. You see, listen to me closely, and I'm pointing this at dads, but this fits everybody here, okay? You understand that? You're naming your children's future for them. You're naming their future for them. He named him Isaac because he wanted to give him the future of that promised covenant. And his grandkids and his great-grandkids and his great-great-grandkids. He was naming his future in a positive way. Let me ask you something, Dad. What are you naming your kids' future? What are you instilling into them that the future would be? 1994, at the Promise Keepers Convention in Texas, there was a pastor that got up and spoke by the name of James Riley. James Riley told his life story that at the age of 2, his dad was arrested, convicted, and sent to prison. By the time he was the age of 7, he was already placed into an orphanage. At the age of 19, he got out of the orphanage and was on his own and committed some crimes and some felonies and got sentenced to prison himself. While in prison, he received Jesus as his Lord and Savior. He got out of prison, began a ministry, surrendered to preach, and is now serving as a pastor. And some years after he got out, he looked up his dad and wanted to mend some broken fences. And they sat down and talked, and he shared with him his life story. And his dad asked him, said, well, what prison did you go in? And he told him, and his dad looked at him kind of shocked and said, well, that's amazing because I built that prison when I was working. Listen to me. Are you building a prison or are you building a palace for your kids? You're doing one or the other. Because you're naming their future. You're naming where they're going to be. Are you passing on the sins of the father? Or are you passing on the promises of the Father? What are you naming your kids? Let me ask you something. Do you have righteous fear of God? Well, let me tell you how you can know. Do you fear God enough that you're concerned about what you watch on TV? Do you fear God enough that you're concerned about what your kids are getting into on the internet? Do you fear God enough that you're careful about where you go and what you say and what you do? Do you fear God enough that you're living right because you understand you're passing that future on to your children? God looked down at Abraham and he said, you know what? There's the guy. I can entrust him with the title of the father of many nations. I can entrust him with it because he has unwavering faith. I can trust him with it because he has righteous fear. Here was Isaac, only 8 days old, and he was circumcising him because God had commanded it. He started at 8 days old. Listen to me. Your kid ain't never too young or too old to do what's right before them and God. He entrusted him because he also saw a man that would keep his focus. If you're over 50, have you noticed it's hard to keep your focus? Right, Trey? You're so much older than me. It's hard to keep your mind on something. It's hard to keep, maybe it's just me, I don't know. He looked at Abraham and he said, you know what? This guy will keep his focus. Look what he said in verse 8. He said, and the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. You see, if you read between the lines here, here's what you see. You see a man that stayed focused on the well-being of his child. He seen to it that he stayed focused on this child getting all of the nourishment that it needed. He seen to it that this child was growing in strength. He seen to it that this child had reached a point of being weaned and he was no longer on the milk but on the meat. Anybody catching up with where I'm going here? Huh? You see, he saw that it was his responsibility to see this child grow. We got way too many people that are still on the milk and they haven't grown to the meat. What I'm talking about, if I've lost you, is the meat of maturing as a Christian, the meat of maturing as a young man and a young lady. I tell you, I shouldn't say this probably from the pulpit, but we'll edit it if it don't come out right, Brad. I get out in the world today, and I get around some of the young people, and man, we've got some fine young people. Let me tell you, our church, we are blessed with some fine, fine young people. And I'm not just saying that because y'all tithe. But I'm going to tell you, there's some of them out there, Lord help us. And the whole problem is they haven't had a father that stayed focused on what his job was. And that's to grow them from milk to meat. To teach them kids what it is to be a young lady. To teach those kids what it is to be a young man. To teach those kids what it is to be respectful and to honor the elderly. Abraham stayed focused on what he had to do. And I tell you what I like about it. is it shows us not only did he know when to discipline and when to do, but he also knew when to encourage and when to lift up. And boy, that's a tricky line, isn't it? You overdo it, you spoil them. You underdo it, you ruin them. I'm convinced there ain't but one way to do it, and that's God's way. That's how you become a good father. You do it God's way. What we need as fathers is to get focused on what is most important. And that's teaching our children the ways of God. I read a story sometime back about a man by the name of George McCluskey. George McCluskey shared that when he got married, he decided that he was going to pray 15 minutes every day, solely that time pray for his wife. He said it wasn't long till they started having children, and after the first child, then he decided he'd pray for 30 minutes, 15 for the wife, 15 for the first. Then he had the second child, so it was up to 45, and he said it ended up, I was praying an hour a day for my family. Wasn't long until his two daughters got married. They ended up marrying two preachers. Wasn't long until those two daughters had their children. George McCluskey still praying an hour a day, an hour a day, an hour a day, every day. They had 4 kids, 3 girls. 3 of those girls married men that were in full-time ministry. The boy ended up being a preacher. That boy had a child, and the other one had a child, and they had 2 boys that went to college together. They were cousins. One of them surrendered to the ministry while in college. The other one became a psychologist. And for the last 30, 40 years, that one child has had a little program, a little outreach ministry that you may have heard of called Focus on the Family by James Dobson. You see what a difference? When George McCluskey made a priority to stay focused on his responsibility to his family, look how God blessed that family. I want to tell you why all of this, what I'm telling you, is so important. Why it's so important as a dad that you have unwavering faith. Why it's so important as a father that you have righteous fear. Why it's so important that you keep your focus. I got a buddy, sits up in the balcony. And I hate to even say this while he's here. But he's a real cowboy. He really is. I hate, hold his ears, Leah. I don't even want him to hear me bragging on him. He's a real cowboy. Now, I've told y'all, I'm just a pretend cowboy. I just, when the going gets tough, I just go home. Real cowboys are rare, aren't they, Joe? I mean, they're rare. But here's what's amazing. Here's this rarity of a man that's a real cowboy, and he has 2 boys that turn out to be more cowboy than probably him or anybody else in the county. Now, is that a coincidence? Let me give it to you another way. I've met probably no one that's more musically talented than our worship leader. Amazing. He can play anything, sing anything, play and sing anything, tune his guitar while he's playing and singing and never sing off key. That's just, it blows my mind that he's able to do this. But here's something that is so ironic. His boy's sitting there beside his mama. Noah can hear a song, sit down at the piano, and within 5 minutes play it. Now, how did such talented, gifted things land so close together in the same hole? How did, as rare as it is to have real cowboys, 3 of them be in the same home? You know how? You know why? Because they named their future. They led them to where they are. And I want you to understand something. I want every father in this room, eyes on me. You're leading your children somewhere. The question is where? Would you stand with me, heads bowed and eyes closed? No one looking around, no one talking for just a moment, please. Dads, I want you to take a very serious moment to think. Where are you leading your kids? Listen to me, it don't matter how young, it don't matter how old you or them are. I'm telling you, I'm 51 years old and I listen to my dad every day. Where are you leading them? Let me ask you this. Are you a good dad? Not according to Dr. Phil or Oprah or some other website. I'm talking about what God says. Because here's what God says. A good father has unwavering faith. He's going to follow and trust God at his word. Are you a good father? A good father has righteous fear. He's afraid to not do what's right because of what a holy God has said. Are you a good dad? A good dad keeps his focus day in and day out. A good dad realizes what his priority of his position is, and that is to raise those kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Because listen, their future is what's hanging in the balance. Maybe this morning, maybe this would be a good time. Maybe it hasn't happened in a long time. For you to just come and kneel at this altar and say, God, what a big responsibility this is. I want to be a good dad. God, help me to live by faith. God, help me to have righteous fear. God, help me to keep my focus on what matters. I don't know how God has spoke to you, but what I do know is what's hanging in the balance, and what's hanging in the balance is your children and their children's children and your children's children. So maybe right now what you need to do as a dad is just slip out of your seat, come kneel at this altar and say, God, help me. Maybe you're standing next to your children's father. How long has it been since you knelt beside him with your arm on his back? You don't even have to say it. Just by being there, you're letting them know, I'm praying for you. I trust you. I'm encouraging you to do what's right. I don't know how God has spoke to you this morning. I just simply have shared with you what God told me to say. Now the question is whether or not you'll listen to what God has told you. Would you do that? Why don't you come right now? You kneel. You talk to God. You do business with God. However He spoke to you, you come. You come.
Silenced every lie, and no other voice will define me. 'Cause I belong to you. I belong to you.